All right. And in terms of how to pronounce my title, ism or ism, I'm thinking more like ism because of also ick, but also kind of like orgasm, ism. Anyway, there's a brilliant and woefully underread essay by Anne Garretta entitled Autofiction, la Ford intérieure et le self-roman, the interior Ford and then self-novel, which you got a taste of yesterday, where the title plays off the similarity in French between fort intérieur, meaning one's innermost being, or the heart of hearts, and Ford intérieur, interior Ford, in which Garretta puts forth the provocative and persuasive argument for taking the auto in autofiction to be that of the automobile, where individual memory driven by the unconscious, the kind of memory that is the motor of autofiction, where that's the product, the invention of the automobile. So this vehicle that effectively brought about a social, spatial, and psychical reconfiguration that has produced the very kind of hyper-individualistic society we live in now. And to riff off Garretta in terms very much of my own devising, in a post-Ford world, we've moved from our Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, to I'm in the driver's seat of my car, leased, bought with cash, or with 14% financing, and never have enough passengers to drive in the HOV lane, therefore I am. And I know that Garretta yesterday I'm just going to like last name the people that I would first name in real life, but so Garretta yesterday, kind of has said that we've moved past the automobile and now we are having things reconfigured by the virtualization of space via Zoom, etc. And I would respectfully disagree, because maybe that's because I live in one of the most gridlocked areas of the country. And the greater Boston area has horrible traffic. And interestingly, with the kind of return to normal part of the pandemic, people started using public transportation less, and there are now more cars on the road than ever before. So we are addicted, at least where I live, to car culture, and I think that that continues to have the kind of automobile effects that Anne was talking about yesterday, Garretta. So, as some of you know, I'm working right now on a project on autofiction, or more precisely, a project against autofiction, which I think has ruined literature the way organizing this country around cars has ruined American infrastructure. And I think the parallel holds in the way having a robust railway system is a measure of what one could call the country solidarity factor, the capacity for people to think of themselves in some kind of collective formation. And by the same logic, the way contemporary French literature has become taken over by autofiction is a marker of how literature is no longer the vehicle for readers to imagine or be incited to construct collectivity in ways that might be able to respond to the profound alienation of life under late capitalism in the throes of climate collapse, but simply it is now a presentation of the self as the site of a worthwhile aesthetic experience, a poesis, as the foundation for some kind of reparative and salutary intersubjective recognition as the origin and object of ethical action. Literature has become another way to reinforce readers' complacency in becoming further entrenched in a prefab self that is arguably at the source of all the world's problems. So we've gone from the prefab self that is now being cast as just the fab self. And I think it is responsible for the rampant consumerism coupled with the rapacious drive to accumulate wealth, for identitarian sectarianism, for getting high on the supply of the promise of being at the top of a hierarchy with its alloying of belonging with power, for nihilism in the face of problems that require corporate collective solutions that the scale of the individual cannot touch. But I digress. I bring up autofiction because I want to take a break from the I of autofiction, the I of the driver, to examine instead the I as it's created and inhabited by contemporary French writer Emmanuel Carrère, who, with his corpus of what he's called nonfiction novels that reenact or reanimate the lives of real others, which at this point constitute the largest vein of his literary career, has created an I that it sits in another self's automobile and yet is somehow still able to take control of the vehicle. So it's the very particular I, then, of the front passenger seat of the driver's ed auto. And I must confess that a large part of my motivation for wanting to talk about Carrère is because I am completely allergic to his I. His I triggers a vehement repulsion on my part that is multiple times stronger than the repulsion of the general autofictional I that I have toward the general autofictional I. I have simply loathed every single one of the nonfiction novels I've read by Carrère because of the way he inserts his authorial I. And I find it utterly baffling that Carrère is a writer who commands universal acclaim and praise on the part of the mainstream press, of lay readers, and of academics, at least in France. And so the rhetoric reserved for Carrère is nothing short of dithyrambic. As Susanna Hunwell describes him in her interview with him for the Paris Review, and this is on your handout, the French, who are notoriously divided on literary matters, all seem to agree. There are few great writers in France today, and Emmanuel Carrère is one of them. So there's a kind of hagiographic dimension to the way he's received, I would say, and that's captured quite neatly in this 2018 volume released by his publisher POL. And POL has been described by the Review of Contemporary Fiction as perhaps the most innovative and important French publisher today. And this book, entitled Emmanuel Carrère, Faire fraction dans le réel, or Emmanuel Carrère, Breaking and Entering into the Real, and it's a very big, fat book. It brings together academics, critics, fellow writers, and filmmakers to celebrate Carrère, lauding the exceptionality of this peerless author, occasionally interrupting the singing of his praises by others to insert Carrère himself via republished handwritten letters, interviews, and photographs provided by the author that show him at all stages of his life, from infancy to the cultural limelight that he now inhabits. Now, when this work was published, Carrère was only 60 years old, so he was nowhere near being put out to pasture. And I have never seen this kind of heart-eyed rhetoric and reception elsewhere of a living author. And he is cast in this book in almost Christic terms as a kind of heroic mediator between his readers and the real that he's breaking and entering into. So a kind of, I guess, Robin Hood of subjectivity or something. And delivering up the subjectivity and the real in ways that we are incapable of accessing or accessing on our own. So in that sense, I guess he's, quite, Catholic rather than, direct access Protestant. I think that Carrère's appeal as a writer seems to lie in the way in his nonfiction novels. He seems to find singular everymen, and I use that in the neutral sense, everymen from whose lives he's able to milk some kind of universal human experience, weaving their lives together with his own, his self joined as tightly to his everymen's selves as slugs and mid-copulation are to each other. And that's the first and only figure on the handout. So to put it another way, where I'm disgusted by Carrère's eye, the rest of his readers can't get enough of the way he inserts himself so authentically into the narration of other people's lives, where his texts become, in some sense, the literary equivalent of conjoined twins, but ones who weren't born that way, but rather sutured together through Carrère's authorial will and the sheer force of his ego. Now, where normally such an inability to hold the self back, such a compulsion to insert and center the self would, I think, be received as narcissism and pose an obstacle in the reader's capacity to connect with said self, in Carrère's case, this narcissistic tendency is recognized and then transformed into a morally salutary mediation between the author and his readers. As Dominique Rabaté and Laurent Demans put it in their introduction to the 2018 Hagiography, and I'm going to just read everything in my own sort of slipshod translations. Perhaps an encounter changed everything in the 90s, that of Jean-Claude Roman, the excessively symbolic name of this criminal who would scandalously import into the ordinary world the lies of fiction, of his terrifying fiction. Perhaps fiction no longer suffices and the writer turns toward investigation, where the real demands to be looked in the face, without a screen, exposing the one who becomes, despite himself, as much a witness as a narrator. This turn toward nonfiction thus entails an autobiographic uncovering between narcissism and critical self-awareness, which is what all his books published since The Adversary recount. It entails also an opening onto others, a moral attention paid to the catastrophic as well as beneficial effects writing can have on those close to us. Emmanuel Carrère's work remains open to other encounters, to new moments of truth. Now, Jean-Claude Roman, who's cited as a turning point in Carrère's career, and the pivot by which would see Carrère leave fiction behind to devote himself to the creation of nonfiction novels, Roman became a household name in France for killing his wife, children, and parents when he was about to be exposed as having lied for 18 years about being a successful medical doctor and researcher at the World Health Organization's headquarters or offices in Geneva. And the case of Roman would be an illustration of Carrère's assertion made at a talk given in February 2009 at NYU that reality is always less realistic than fiction. So the larger-than-life nature of the sensational case would thus become the event that would rupture the membrane or divider that had kept Carrère up to that point on the side of fiction, and I quite like his fiction. so that he would then cross over to the real and never come back, holding, though, onto the label of novel because of the way he continues to structure and write these verifiable events, happenings, and people in novelistic fashion. So novel then for him has more to do with facture and form than with the fictionality that's been traditionally identified as being the novel substance. And now I'm just going to go through Carrére's post-fictional turn so that you can get a sense of just how far-reaching and roving his appropriating eye is in terms of what lives he's interested in alighting upon with his first person and in appropriating them toward literary ends. So again, Carrére's turn away from fiction begins with his Truman Capote-esque telling of the story of Jean-Claude Roman in The Adversary, published in 2000, which inserts as a kind of frame narrative the story of his meeting with Roman in prison, which then serves as the support for his reconstructing Roman's life, offering up some sort of account or explanation for how this ordinary man could have become so tangled up in lies that would prove to be fatal to his loved ones. He would then follow up on The Adversary in 2007 with Un roman russe, My Life as a Russian Novel, which brings together three real stories. The story of Andras Thomas, who was a Hungarian peasant who had been detained in the USSR for 56 years after being captured by the Red Army. And this is a story that Carrère had recounted in a documentary he'd filmed called Retour à Kotelnitz, Return to Kotelnitz. There's also the story of the blowing up of Carrère's relationship with a now ex-girlfriend, Sophie, following his publishing a pornographic short story, not very good short story, in Le Monde that was addressed to her. And finally, the story of his maternal grandfather, a Georgian who had emigrated to France in the 1920s and had been executed after the liberation of France in World War II for collaboration. Then came D'autres vies que la mienne, Other Lives Than Mine, in 2009, which tells the story of the small claims judge with a prosthetic leg who delivers up his own first-person account of Carrère's then-girlfriend's sister who succumbed to cancer, but also he's telling the story of the parents who survived the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka that their little girl did not, so parental grief. And Carrère just happened to meet these people because he had been vacationing in Sri Lanka at the same time. Then you have in 2011, Limonov, which got translated into the English as the ridiculous Limonov, the outrageous adventures of the radical Soviet poet who became a bum in New York, a sensation in France, and a political anti-hero in Russia, which I think gives you a good sense of how in the Anglophone reception of Carrère, his kind of non-fiction novel just becomes non-fiction. And this is a biography of Russian dissident Edouard Limonov, whose self-mythologizing Carrère gives full license to. And it's interspersed throughout with first-person interludes musing about Putin in sympathetic terms and admiringly describing Putin's masculinity as manifested in his virile airs. And although it was published as a novel and presented thus as a fictional biography, it might be better described as Julian Barnes does in a review for The Guardian as follows. Carrère claimed in a recent interview that it was not a biography because he didn't check facts or check out what Limonov actually said. But this doesn't make his book a novel, rather a knowingly inaccurate biography. And then finally, in 2016, Carrère published Le Royaume, The Kingdom, which is a retelling of the story of the early Christian church by putting himself in Luke's shoes as Luke encounters Paul, and then reading his own Carrère's life and his various crises of faith onto the evangelist. And then in 2020, Carrère published his auto-fictional Yoga, which begins ostensibly as an essay on self-help and yoga, only to recount the mental breakdown he had after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015, with Carrère winding up in a psychiatric ward. And then it was later revealed that Carrère's ex-wife, journalist Hélène Devin, whom he'd been in a relationship with during the vast majority of his non-fictional turn, had, as part of their divorce, been able to set the condition that Carrère not be able to write her as a character without her explicit consent. And she didn't realize that during the divorce negotiations, as this condition was being negotiated, that Carrère was actually finishing up Yoga, in which she featured centrally. So when Devin received the manuscript of Yoga a few days after the divorce had been finalized, she did not recognize the truth in any of what Carrère had written about her and their life together. For instance, what Carrère narrates as a 2-month stay in Greece with migrants that was framed as a period of recovery by him, Devin says was a short trip of a few days that took place before Carrère's hospitalization. So Devin came out in French Vanity Fair to set the record straight in September 2020, explaining the great lengths she'd had to go to make Carrère respect his legal obligations, which resulted in there being a gaping Devin-shaped hole in the published version of the text, after which point Carrère, who had been a favorite for the Prix Goncourt, disappeared from the final shortlist released in October, as to be eligible for the Goncourt, the text must be fictional, and Devanc's disclosure basically framed the text in more non-fictional terms. So if I've gone into a bit more detail about yoga here, it's because I think it's revelatory of the way Carrère has managed to, despite a chronic disregard for truth in the sense of veracity, to be received as a writer who is deeply sincere and authentic, so fraught terms as we know, and at the end of the day, someone who is able to reveal more about the truth than the truth itself might be able to. So the truth itself needs mediation by this heroic character, Carrère. Returning to Rabaté and de Mons' characterization of Carrère, I think it's peculiar the way that they cast the real against fiction as something that requires being confronted without mediation, so without a screen, in their words, when Carrère is obviously a screen, a form of mediation. And the laudatory reception he receives is due in large part to his being recognized as being a screen, as playing such a mediating or intercessory role. So he's being treated as a kind of ideal mirror when his reflective surface is in fact quite a distorting one. But the distortion itself is being treated as somehow a more valuable delivering up of the real than what would be an actual unmediated experience of the real. Critics, especially in the Anglophone media sphere, readily acknowledge the massive size of Carrère's ego, using the language of narcissism to describe him. Yet in the French sphere, Carrère seems untouchable, filled as it is with voices that are ready to rush to defend him against such charges. Paul Garapon, for instance, who's an editor at the Presse Universitaire de France, refers to Carrère's noblesse littéraire, or literary nobility, seeing in him someone who has what are now bygone ambitions to write a total social novel. He sees Carrère's egocentric literary enterprise as being in the service of the collective, so kind of like Carrère's 21st century Zola, in other words. And he sees Carrère's taking up real people as characters as being, in fact, an act of decentering the authorial self in an eminently ethical, read heroic way, one that inaugurates a new role for the author that is, quote, not concerned with writing history through some unknown aesthetic capacity to produce the new, but concerned with recounting history and seeing the new and the great in what's apparently ordinary. In short, reestablishing what's true by having gone in search of the other. Marianne Ruxel-Lubach, the author of a recent monograph on Carrère entitled Emmanuel Carrère, écrivain en eau trouble, like Garapon, sees Carrère's self-insertion throughout all of his nonfiction novels as a way of turning to the other, of making space for other lives themselves. Quote, "The I has become the pivot and absolute mark of writing. Brandished as a token of humility by Emmanuel Carrère, his subjectivity is regularly reproached for narcissism by certain readers because of the attention given to me. It nonetheless appears to permit the possibility of concern for the other, including in the form of biographical fiction or life with Limonov. It engenders, moreover, a both sociological and moralist reflection on greatness and distinction. If the authorial I has become central, its subjectivity appears to be conceived as a token of humility." So she's really hung up on this idea that Carrère is using the self as his self as a kind of proof of his humility, which I find kind of strange, of the author's responsibility toward the persons he includes in his texts. An ethos emerges, and in return, a man, in his ambivalence, seems to find his place in his life and in the world, a powerful singularity, perfectly in touch with and grappling with his epoch. Marie, have either of you been described as a powerful singularity, perfectly in touch with and grappling with our epoch? There you go. No? Okay. So Carrère is special. He's special, right? Even the people whose experiences he appropriates and whose voices he ventriloquizes are grateful for being treated as grist for Carrère's literary mill, as in the case of Étienne Régal, the juge d'instruction, the examining magistrate with the prosthetic leg, about whom Carrère tells the story of his being a really great small claims judge, intervening in the seemingly trivial and banal legal dramas of things such as insurance adjustments that have an outsized consequence on the lives of the nobodies who find themselves at the mercy of institutions. And interestingly, Nicolas Sarkozy was a really big fan of D'autres vies que la mienne. So make of that what you will. But Rigal, he contributed to this volume an essay entitled Lequel parle au travers de l'autre? Who speaks through whom? In which he pushes back on the position, on the narrative that he is being turned into a character, into Madame Bovary. And that he said, because someone came up to him and said, oh, what does it feel like to be Madame Bovary in a great novel? And Rigal was like, oh, I'm not a character. But Carrère, Rigal basically pushes back against that narrative by suggesting that he is actually speaking through Carrère, whom he has explicitly asked to speak for him. Quote, I asked him to be the strong, clear voice that would carry this experience and would allow me to transmit it. I wanted him to speak for me, for him to carry my testimony far. So this kind of vision of this, like one-legged man with a prosthetic leg who needs the strong kind of able-bodiedness of Carrère's voice, right? And so this, again, not in order to be transformed into a character. He's asking Carrère to do this, not because he thinks of himself as being characterized through the process, being turned into a fictional personage, but rather because he, Rigal, wants to be able to appropriate in turn his transformation into literature, to turn literature then into history. Quote, I imagine my grandchildren reading this book one day perhaps, and seeing in it their grandfather's history. The novel will have become history. It has already become this, even for me. While I'm sure Etienne Rigal is perfectly sincere in his gratitude for Carrère's having told his story, having carried his experience as far as being a bestseller can carry it, to many more readers and witnesses than he would ever have been able to garner for himself as a judge living a quiet life in Lyon, I think that there's something rather gauche in his testament to Carrère's literary largesse being included in a volume that is supposedly going to provide an intellectually grounded overview of a writer's career. To me, it seems akin to one of the three little pigs being quoted in an homage to the wolf as having asked the wolf to blow their house down, and oh, nobody has ever blown their house down nearly as well as the wolf did at porcine request. The wolf did a much better job than Hurricane Sandy. The kind of admiration surrounding Carrère is anchored in a certain idea that he has somehow done these ordinary people a great honor in plucking them out of oblivion, that Carrère has put his eye in service of those everyday eyes who are relegated to the fait divers or to a local obituary. His eye, able to draw out what is extraordinary, literary, about lives that we would otherwise pass over without the intervention of his authorial eye that tells us, stop, listen. That Carrère, in taking such an interest in nobodies, is so humble, despite the way you can't get very far in any Carrère text without tripping over his eye. But this should be forgiven this eye should be forgiven for being so omnipresent. Carrère should be forgiven for littering his text with his subjectivity, because he is just so self-deprecating. He narrates his subjects' lives in ways that cast into relief the abjection of his own person, of what a bad husband he is, what a bad boyfriend, what a bad son, what a bad believer, etc. But where his critics see an ethical eye that humbles itself to amplify other people's subjectivities, his eye turning into a platform for these others, I see that platform as a feint, which distracts readers who are so impressed by the summoning of ordinary persons into the sacred halls of literature, that distracts them from the way that structurally Carrère's eye is a fundamentally appropriative and extractive one. He latches onto and burrows into other people's eyes, parasitizing these other authentic lived experiences to create a carefully crafted version of his eye as an exemplar of literary ethicalness that is transformed into significant material gains, because his books are all bestsellers. There's a kind of snobism and classism at work in the reception of Carrère that irks me, as so much of it depends, I would say, on the fact that he comes from a well-off, cultivated milieu, being the son of the late presiding secretary of the Académie Française, Hélène Carrère d'Ancos. And it goes back to the idea of literary nobility that's been associated with him. Carrère is effectively treated as having a certain kind of literary noblesse oblige that gives to the great lord in his stature and power a kind of droit de cuissage, or the jus prime noctis, so the right of the first night, which is a maybe phantasmatic construction, but I think an interesting one nonetheless, that attributes to the feudal lord the right to have sexual relations with any female subject, especially on her wedding night, in which the Lord is essentially allowed to supersede and take the literal place of the man who has ostensibly sealed and solidified his place vis-a-vis the woman via nothing less than a sacrament. So to the droit de cuissage analogy I'm using here is to say that Carrère has basically taken the entire world and all of history as the purview of his seigneurial right. So the way Carrère allows himself to tackle any and all subjects is the manifestation of the kind of certainty of one's structural right to do so that I think we get with the aristocracy of the Ancien Régime, pre-guillotine, pre-having to marry bourgeois, of course. Now, don't get me wrong. French readers do love a rags to riches story, and they have elevated authors, although not unanimously, such as Annie Ernaux and Edouard Louis, who commanded admiration because of the way they're able to transform themselves through literature, turning their ordinary, unprivileged life into the stuff of, in the case of Ernaux, a Nobel Prize. And Morgane Cadieux has just published a book entitled On Both Sides of the Tracks that examines the way social mobility has seized the contemporary French political and literary imaginary. But I would argue that Carrère is even more beloved because of the way in his books, it's not a scrappy poor person who manages to cross class lines. And here, class lines don't strictly kind of map onto economic privilege, so the haves versus the have-nots, but rather in this literary economy, I would say it's about the known versus the unknowns. Because Carrère in this framework is the aristocrat who's not afraid to get dirty, to leave his, fancy chateau, to go trekking in pursuit of the lives that we would never have access to otherwise. The ordinary Joe Schmoes of an Etienne Rigal, or the grieving parents who just happen to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. The complicated political heroes and anti-heroes you've never heard of before Carrère. The monsters populating our prisons and true crime watch lists whose interiorities seem as inaccessible as the carceral spaces they find themselves in. Even the evangelist who helped found a major world religion. But Carrère, oh noble Carrère, instead of keeping these lives, this cultural patrimony in his personal collection, he puts them in the public domain through the act of publishing. People admire extraordinary individuals like Ernaux and Louis, but they are grateful to Carrère, for Carrère, because his entire oeuvre is basically cast as a gift bestowed to us through the indefatigable nature of his outsized eye that is able to be the support for a literary project that seems total. Carrère's capacity to locate these lives, to gain access to them through interviews and meetings, to know the kinds of random historical actors he likes to recuperate, all of this is, of course, the function of his privileged status, of having the networks, the means, the time to be able to do all this. His positioning in his nonfiction novels, far from being that of an ethical or a humble eye, is the incredibly comfortable and privileged eye that can play at making a great show of relinquishing importance through decentering. So, hints of Marie Antoinette, I would say. His readers call attention to how he abases himself to deliver to his readers lives that are told in ways that challenge our conceptualization of the relation between truth and fiction, history and invention. But what I see is what I would call a power bottom eye. Carrère's eye exercises power precisely through taking on the position of the bottom who is filled with the other, who derives his pleasure from having his eye serve as a receptacle for the other, manipulating the other for his own gratification. So I had originally planned on this paper raising the question of whether it's ever possible for an eye to ethically narrate another if we take the ethical to be grounded in an experience and recognition of equality, when the position that Carrère assumes vis-a-vis his subjects is never equal, with his self-abasement artificially placing Carrère below them. But as is often the case, once you start writing something, things can take on a mind of their own, and I am shifting directions to pursue instead what it means that Carrère is as celebrated as he is for this power bottom eye position that he has perfected. One thing that I find unsettling about the way people talk about Carrère is the way they celebrate his renouncing invention to commit instead to recounting the real, encapsulated in the following lines from Yoga. Writing is the site of truth. Literature is the place where one does not lie. It's an absolute imperative. And Hélène de Vinck did point out the irony in her piece in Vanity Fair of this being published in a manuscript that is basically chock full of lies. So people, readers of Carrère, the lovers of Carrère, they take his self-professed commitment to truth, which has taken the form of turning his back on fiction as a way of pitting fictionality against factuality, so of pitting the imagined against the real. Quote, "The text thus has us reading an experience of life that is more novelistic than fiction could ever be. The novel gives in the face of roman. Le roman cède devant roman," to repeat Dominique Rabaté's pun on the adversary. We have then Carrère, champion of the real, a real alpha, a powerful singularity, wielding the real to dominate the beta that is wimpy fiction, the erstwhile novel, fallen from grace in contemporary French literature, which is dominated by what in the States we might call creative nonfiction. And again, it's interesting to see the generic shifts between France and the Anglophone literary market. So what we would call literary memoir, or perhaps the kind of imaginative reconstruction of history that we get through Cecilia Hartman's critical fabulation. But this creative nonfiction, in France, it is put under the sign of fiction via autofiction and exofiction. So respectively, fictionalized autobiography and fictionalized biography, very roughly speaking. Now, I think this is very interesting in light of POL also publishing Marie Dariussecq, who is arguably the fiercest and most vocal contemporary proponent of fictionality, of imagination, of an I that is separate and distinct from the author, of the author's freedom to create, inhabit, or not inhabit an infinite number of I's as virtualities. In her Rapport de police, accusation de plagiat et autres modes de surveillance de la fiction, or police report, plagiarism, accusations, and other modes of surveilling fiction, Dariussecq passionately takes the defense of the novel as a literary form of the possible, of all possibles, one that should not have any limits placed on it. And she does this in a context in which readers and editors in France are increasingly drawn to and reproduce, through their production and consumption choices, texts that occupy the place that the novel has traditionally held. And some of these texts still bear the label of novel, others no longer bear any generic markers at all, but they all proudly and compulsively wear their referential colors. This is real. This isn't invented. This is your world, the world, our world, delivered up in literary form, where the material of literature, the material that writers work with, it's no longer language, but it is instead the real. In the publishing world revisiting of the Freudian family romance of sexual difference, where Carrère and Dariussecq are arguably the most prominent authors under POL's imprimatur, Carrère is the new man, the manly man who's able to confess his faults, who apologizes for not doing more around the house, but then proceeds to not do more around the house. The self-aware, sympathetic to feminism man, the man who knows how to parrot the feminist stance of self-positioning, who knows how to center the self in ways that make you believe his I needs to take up so much space. And on the other hand, we have Dariussecq, the fictionalist, the woman who tells stories from her point of view of invented characters, some of whom are I's, who are definitely not her. And it's this disidentification with the narrative I that has led to treating the novelist as a creator of fiction as someone who distorts reality. The way a stick will look bent in water because light refracts, and this is the consequence of water and light being different, just as the authorial I and the narrated I are different. But this difference is one that Carrère rejects, insisting to return to the image of the copulating slugs, on the union of the authorial I, the narrated I, and the other person's I's that give the narrated I enough substance to be able to stand. In this regard, Étienne Régal was right to suggest Carrère was being narrated by him. Carrère's I, despite how it's described as possessing unreal proportions, is surprisingly fragile, unable to stand by itself, requiring other people's eyes in a subjective analog to the prosthetic leg Régal uses. And so here we have very interesting echoes of David Wills's prosthetic self, but blent very differently in Carrère's use of it. So literature, as the site of aesthetic experience, is now one where the aesthetic itself has become seemingly irremediably tied up with the real, where one of the criteria for literary aesthetics now appears to be how much of the real a text holds. And Carrère is a perfect example of this, where his status as a writer is intimately bound to how real his texts are perceived and pronounced as being. So the consequence for this has been that the realm of the imagination has now been left behind, relegated to second-class status, cut off from the aesthetic that it had for so long been the support for. That the I, once the springboard for endless invention and inexhaustible plasticity, has now become pure reflection, where the I becomes the Stendhalian mirror that shows the reader the world, rather than the novel being the mirror that can show the reader their I, if they still believe in the I. And in so doing, the I becomes the world itself, displacing the I that would see the world, so that seeing the world has been swept away, replaced instead by being the world. What the Carrère pairing within POL calls attention to is, I think, a kind of regendering of the novel that is happening, at least in France, with fiction, in its non-referentiality, becoming once again, back to the 19th century, the purview of the feminine. And I think this has gone unnoticed, partly because of how feminine autofiction is as well, with many women writing the real. And Darrieussecq pointed this out yesterday in terms of the kind of ghettoization that has happened in France with women being, just these, little women talking about their little personal lives in autofiction. The troubling gendered implications of this hegemonic reconfiguring of contemporary French literature that we can see play out in real time within POL's roles, I think can be summed up as follows. The masculine is real, the feminine is fake, and here we are in some kind of twisted time warp, back in the morasses of feminine artifice, masquerade, mimicry, against the foil of masculine authenticity. But we're not able to see the way artifice is being revalued and returned to old reactionary positions because we've got too much reality in our eyes, or perhaps our eyes. Thank you.